Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe. I'm going over Chapter 9 in the Communication in the Real World textbook. And this chapter is on delivering a speech. So we have a few tips here on how to deliver a speech well. Chapter 8 went over how to prepare the speech, how to get everything ready beforehand. But here's some uh, tips. Once you have the speech prepared, how you can execute it well. My biggest tip is always practice, right? Practice, practice, practice. The more you practice beforehand, the more confident you're going to be going into the speech, and you'll be able to um, kind of fix any of those issues that you may be having. It's also helpful uh, to practice in as a real environment as possible. So if you're giving a speech on stage, practice on the stage, right? So if you have an opportunity to do that, make the environment as close to where you're really going to be presenting as possible for you to take care of it. But this section starts with managing public speaking anxiety, so giving other tips of public speaking anxiety. I always tell my students, especially when I teach public speaking, that I had a speech in high school. I think it was 10th grade. I was a speech assignment, and I was just so nervous about doing it. I just skipped it, right? I didn't do it. And so now I teach communication. So I've come a long way. But certainly I have some communication anxiety. It says communication apprehension is what it's calling it here, is more the textbook term. I hear it more colloquially named social anxiety, right? Kind of similar thing. Certainly a lot of people have social anxiety when it comes to public speaking. So communication apprehension in that public speaking environment is extremely common. Some people also have social anxiety in other environments, and certainly those are things that can be worked on as well. But public speaking anxiety specifically is a type of communication apprehension that produces physiological, cognitive, and behavioral reactions in people when faced with real or imagined presentation. So I've noticed some students, they prefer giving it in person because then they can see the live audience reaction. Some students prefer giving speeches online, especially asynchronous environments, so they don't have to deal with that live audience reaction, or so they can re-record it if they don't feel comfortable with it. Certainly there's anxieties no matter the format in which you're giving a speech. Uh, but again, the sort of things you can do to address public speaking anxiety are pretty similar across the modalities. So we can't stop you from having anxiety. What's helped for me, just when I started studying communication, I learned more how to be a better communicator. So I had some good tips and information that helped me feel more confidence. And then I just had lots of practice. When you take communication classes, when you major in communication, you give lots of speeches, you engage in a lot of different types of communication, and that helps build the confidence and eases the anxiety. So if you do have some, oh, I'm too afraid to give a speech, well, you're not going to get over that fear unless you start putting yourself in that position. So you may feel like you're a train wreck at first. I haven't seen students be a train wreck with their speeches, but you may feel like a train wreck. But certainly you can adapt once you start giving more speeches and more presentations. You'll feel more comfortable. You may feel more comfortable with a specific audience. Like I know some students say, "Hey, I work with kids all the time. I don't mind talking to a group of kids, but I don't want to talk to adults." So again, seeing where you have those anxieties, you can start. It says here about the systematic desensitization. So you become less anxious about it when you're exposed to it more often. So that's a bit of what I'm sharing about. And the desensitization, it can be real exposure to a situation. It could be kind of you're trying to approximate the situation as best you can, even imagining yourself being in the situation and being successful, and it can be helpful. They've had studies where basketball players were shooting free throws, and they had one group actually do like 100 free throws and see how that improved their success rate. And another group were just imagining themselves do 103 free throws, and they were successful each and every time in their imagination. And the group that imagined it was actually more successful after that exercise. They had better improvement over their race beforehand. So again, just imagining yourself being confident and successful in that situation can be really helpful. But also, once you get more experience and have experience being successful with public speaking, you can think back on those situations saying, "Hey, I've done this before. It's gone well. It's going to go well again this time, or it's very likely to go well again this time." So talks here about cognitive restructuring. So that comes a lot from psychology, doing the cognitive restructuring, changing the way you're thinking about something. So you can process through the fears and understand where your fears are coming from. And oftentimes these fears are irrational. Students always say, "Oh, I'm afraid the other students are judging me." Well, in a classroom, we all want you to be successful. We're looking forward to, we don't not waiting for you to mess up, right? looking forward to helping each other be better speakers or better communicators in general. And so once you start pulling apart that, oh, maybe my fear is a little irrational. Uh, it says here that a lot of people fear public speaking more than snakes, heights, financial ruin, or even death. The public speaking is the biggest fear that people have. But once you start thinking about it, like, hey, maybe that's not, there, it's a little bit irrational to fear public speaking more than dying. So we can start to kind of push ourselves to see things from another perspective and to think about the situation differently. There's communication or orientation modification therapy is a type of cognitive restructuring that encourages people to think about public speaking as a conversation rather than a performance. I always encourage my students to be very conversational with their speeches just because it's easier to listen to than giving a whole big performance. And performances that takes a lot of preparation, a lot of practice beforehand. Whereas a conversation, you have conversations every day. So certainly you're going to want to rehearse your speech a bit, practice it. But if you're feeling like you're performing it on stage, you may feel uncomfortable. Whereas if you're just, hey, I learned about this subject, I'm going to have a conversation with you and share what I've learned. Right, that may feel a little more comfortable for many students. And I talked about the positive visualization, and that if you visualize yourself being successful, giving a speech, that can be helpful in helping you overcome your anxiety and also creating more success for you. Whereas, again, if you do negative visualization, just worry about all the different ways you're gonna mess up, it will lead you to be more likely to mess up, right? That's that self-fulfilling prophecy. So positive visualization is the way to go. Much preferred, but again, it's easier said than done. And then skills training, right? You're in a communication classroom, we're learning about different skills. So skills training is a great way to manage public speaking anxiety that helps you feel more confident because you're saying, hey, I've learned how to do this, I've learned how to do it well, and I'm just going to put what I learned into practice. Next year talks about physical relaxation exercises. So just being able to calm ourselves down and have those, there's different breathing exercises, there's stretching exercises. So certainly there's a ton of them that you can do, but just, slow, deep breaths, breathe in, breathe out. You know, breathing, there's a variety of ways to do it. I've heard the kind of 3x3 square. Um, certainly there's a lot of different ways to do breathing exercises. You can do YouTube if you want to learn about different breathing exercises and find one that works for you. And that's one of the things that I've noticed. There's not one breathing exercise or stretching exercise that works well for everybody, but certainly there's a ton out there, and you can find something that works for you. I've done some mindfulness as well, and with mindfulness, I can't just sit there and think about nothing. Right? My mind's always racing. Makes it so I can't sleep very well at night. But with that mind always racing, I've noticed that I can't just sit there or just be mindful of your environment. But what I have learned, a type of mindfulness, active mindfulness, will be mindful while doing something, like mindfully washing the dishes, mindfully gardening, right? I do good being gardening out in nature and just focusing on that. I can do that, right? So figuring out what works for you is helpful. So there's definitely a lot of breathing exercises. Find a breathing exercise that works for you. Talks about stretching. There's yoga, Tai Chi, Pilates. You can just do simple stretches. Sometimes I've just, went on YouTube and looked for chair stretching, right? Because I'm sitting in a chair, office all the time. So just figure out what sort of stretching exercises can I do. That can help you as well. So figuring out what sort, especially if you're like sitting in the classroom and you're waiting to be the next one up to give a speech, you can't really sit there and do Pilates, but you may be able to do some chair stretching exercises, some breathing techniques to help you calm down. Another suggestion is vocal warm-up exercises. Certainly they'll do this in competitive speaking or even in theater, right? If you're doing a theater performance, open mics, giving speeches too, you can do vocal warm-up exercises. A lot of professional speakers do that as well. So it talks about the motorboating sound. Certainly there's a lot of other ones to do. Again, go on YouTube if you want to look for some. I don't necessarily recommend vocal warm-ups as my first recommendation. I think the breathing works a lot better in my experience, is more widely spread, in terms of it works. It works for more people than necessarily vocal warm-up exercises. But it can be helpful as well to do those vocal warm-ups. Then it has a list here of top 10 ways to reduce speaking anxiety. So number one, remember you're not alone. Public speaking anxiety is very common. You just have to confront it. Number two, you cannot literally die of embarrassment. Audiences are forgiving and understanding, right? Your audience is rooting for you. They want you to be successful. And if you need to pause and pick it back up, certainly just do that. Give yourself a moment to collect yourself and then go back ahead. Number three, remember it always feels worse than it looks. I've heard this in terms of kind of theater, but also in speech. If you say the wrong thing or mess something up, like your audience doesn't know what you're going to say. They don't know your lines or what you're planning on presenting. So you may know you messed up, but your audience may not know the difference. And we just think that's the way that it's supposed to be. Number four, take deep breaths. Again, it releases endorphins, which naturally fight the adrenaline that causes anxiety. Number five, look the part, dress professionally to enhance your confidence. So again, looking at what kind of clothes you're wearing can be helpful. If you put some thought into dressing nicely, you may feel more confident that way. Number six, channel your nervousness into positive energy and motivation, right? Easier said than done, but certainly, if you're anxious about something, being able to use that anxiety to get it done and work, use that as motivation to get something done. Certainly, people do it. I do it. I'm able to do it, but not everyone can. Number seven, start your outline and research early. If you have better information, you're going to have higher confidence. If you're able to put more information in the speech, it's going to be great. Whereas if you're just like throwing it together at the last minute, you're probably not going to be as confident to be able to get through the information. Number eight, practice and get feedback from a trusted source. Do not practice just for your cat, right? Cats can't give very good feedback in terms of public speaking. So if you have a friend, a family member who you can present to, that can be very helpful. Or even just recording yourself and watching the recording back. That's been helpful for me because sometimes I get excited or nervous and I start talking really fast. And it wasn't until I heard a recording of myself that I noticed how fast I was talking. So it reminds me to slow down and take a deep breath if I notice myself getting either excited or nervous. Visualize success through positive thinking. We've talked about that before. Those positive visualization techniques have been proven in research to work and be very helpful. And number 10, prepare, prepare, prepare. Practice is a speaker's best friend. I think that one speaks for itself. So 9.2 goes into delivery methods. So we went through how to deal with anxiety because the anxiety is very common, but there's different types of delivery. So the first type that it goes through here is impromptu delivery, where a speaker has little to no time to prepare a speech. So there's not a lot of time to do research, audience analysis, organizing, or practice. So sometimes when I'm in a public speaking classroom, I give students just different prompts. So one of the examples of this is like in an interview. Sometimes they'll give you the questions in advance so you can prepare, which is really nice. And that's very much a recommended strategy to keep everyone on the same page. But even if you don't have, prepared, you may have other questions to go along with those besides the ones that are given in advance. So impromptu delivery, you may, in an interview, you might do that. Or if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, how's your school going?" What kind of things? That's an impromptu speech. You can maybe talking to a few people and giving a little pitch about why Ridgewater College is a great college and really helping you meet your career goals, whatever it may be. So again, it says only skilled public speakers with much experience are usually able to pull off an impromptu delivery without looking unprepared. But sometimes it's good to have maybe, an elevator speech prepared if you're going to a networking event. You may be giving impromptu speeches on the different questions or interactions as it comes up. But if you kind of have general ideas, it can be helpful. When we look at competitive speech and debate teams, they do impromptu speeches, but they do a lot of research to prepare themselves for the impromptu speeches. They're not given a lot of time to prepare the speech itself, but they do put effort into doing the research and being knowledgeable on a variety of topics that they could fit into an impromptu prompt. So Mark Twain famously said, "It usually takes me more than 3 weeks to prepare a good impromptu speech." He's just pointing out the difficulties of doing that well. So impromptu is just you're doing it without really any preparation. You can't organize a speech. You're not outlining it. You're just giving a speech based on what you know already. So manuscript delivery is speaking from a written or printed document that contains the entirety of the speech is known as a manuscript delivery. It can be the best choice when the speech has a lot of complicated information or the contents of the speech are going to be quoted or published. I don't recommend using a lot of manuscript delivery. It says a lot of novice speakers aren't going to find yourself into that situation. Maybe at a graduation speech, you're going to use a manuscript delivery. But a lot of times, so what we write differently than we speak. So I've had students try and write out their speech and it sounds really unnatural and it's hard to listen to and hard to follow along. So students who do a manuscript delivery or even professionals who do a manuscript delivery, they have to learn speech writing, right? You have to learn how to write a speech and because it's very different than writing an essay. So sometimes if I am writing out part of what I want to say, I'll verbally read it out loud and then edit things and think, oh, that doesn't sound right, or let me fix things here. This sounds a little bit awkward. So I take some time to go through it and edit things to make it sound more natural for me. I may even write in some pauses. So if I'm going to pause here, let them take in some information. People who really get into it, you can write a lot of different. This is how I'm going to say each thing, and like a presidential address or a politician's stump speech, they may have how they're going to say each word, not just what words they're going to say, but how they're going to say each word. So it can be very, very thoughtful. Takes a lot of work to do it well. I don't recommend. I never recommend for my students to read their speeches just because it takes a lot of work, and I try to make things easier, right? And memorized delivery, you're going to see this in theater, like live theater on stage. They're definitely going to be remembering what they're going to say and have a memorized delivery because they're not going to have any notes. Some students attempt to memorize their speech because they think it's going to help them be more confident. But if your anxiety spikes or you mess up some of the words and then you're trying to figure out, oh, what was I going to say, right? You get thrown off track or the audience is responding differently than you expected. It's helpful to be able to give yourself room to navigate and adjust things in the moment. And so certainly you can do a memorized delivery if you want to remember everything you're going to say. One of the tips it has for memorized delivery, if you're going to do that, even with a lot of practice, memories can fail. So if you opt to use a memorized delivery, make sure you have several entry points determined so you can pick up at those spots rather than the beginning of the speech. So you know what you're going to say from this point forward. So I think of like in terms of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So my entry point would be L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, right? I can pick up the alphabet at the L. So again, just a silly example, but in your speech, it's going to be longer. So you're going to have different points where you can pick up on if you need to restart yourself or figure out where you're going to go. So it says here, it's best to use a memorized delivery if the speech is short, like 1 to 2 minutes, if it's personal, like a brief toast, or if the speech is going to repeat it numerous times, like a tour guide story. Because if you're going to say a lot, then it makes more sense to memorize it. But if you're just giving the speech once, it's a lot of work to do a memorized delivery. This one here, extemporaneous delivery. This is the one I always tell my students to do. This is what I prefer students to do. I think it is easiest to handle. It's easiest in terms of gives you time to prepare. So you know what you're going to say. You get to organize your speech. You get to get those source citations, everything in there, but you're not stuck to specific words. So you have some flexibility and the actual words that come out of your mouth to explain the main points that you're going to share. So extemporaneous delivery entails memorizing the overall structure and the main points of the speech, then speaking from a keyword or key phrase notes. So you may have a keyword outline. I usually speak from an outline. That's what I prefer. Some students prefer note cards, so they're giving a speech with notes. But again, just keywords to remind yourself of what you're doing. I like the outline, and then I use a pencil to kind of check off. Okay, I talked about that, as I'm going through the speech. So that's how I would often present if I am using an outline. Or I may just have some sort of notes. Even when I'm teaching in the classroom, I usually will have notes on my computer. Here are the things that I want to talk about, so I can make sure that I kind of check everything off. So if you're preparing a speech to deliver extemporaneously, you're going to want to practice your speech early and then continue to practice as you're revising your content. This allows you to, again, see which way you like presenting things. And again, it may come out a little bit differently in the moment when you're actually giving the speech, and that's fine, right? You certainly can react to the audience. You may phrase things a little different. You may add a point. You may miss something, and that's fine with extemporaneous speaking, right? You're just going to be able to go with the flow and adapt to the moment. So I think that's very helpful. I think it's a very helpful way of doing it. And again, this can sound a lot more conversational, right? You're going to pick out stories to tell people. You may have some direct quotes, so you may have parts that you're reading, but certainly really just talking to the audience, and it's like a conversation. So those are different ways of presenting a speech. So here, now this next section's on practice. So the tips that the textbook gives here for practicing is 3 phases to the practice process. So first, practice as you're working through your ideas and drafting your outline. All right. So even if you're making your outline, you may just be on your computer and then verbally say some of it. Say, okay, that kind of sounds right for that section. Or maybe I'm missing something here. This doesn't seem long enough. So just practice as you're drafting your ideas, as you're getting your outline, and seeing how it starts sounding. The second phase is to practice for someone to get some feedback. So again, if you don't have a person, you can record yourself giving the speech and give yourself some feedback, right? Hopefully you're a trusted source of information, but often we're more critical of ourselves than other people will be. That's why it's good to have someone outside of ourselves We're just not nitpicking and attacking ourselves and having that negative visualization that, oh, I'm going to screw everything up, right? You need positive visualization, and an outside person is going to be more helpful for getting that feedback. And then the third phase of the practice process, according to this textbook, is put the final changes onto the speech. So now you did some practice, you had the speech together, you got some feedback, you made some adjustments, and now you're ready to go. So that's a bit about the practicing process as this discusses. So other aspects of the delivery is the vocal delivery. So the vocal delivery is the components of the speech that relate to your voice. This could be the rate, the volume, the pitch, the articulation, the pronunciation, the fluency. There's a lot of different things here that we're going to go through. So rate of speaking refers to how fast or slow you speak. Again, sometimes if you're anxious or excited, you can start to speak really fast. If you speak too slow, you may lose the audience's interest. And it's good to have a little bit of variation with all these. So you don't want to just speak at the same rate throughout the speech. So for example, you might want pauses. So that's going to slow down your rate of speech if you have a pause there for people to take in some information. Next here is the volume, so how loud or soft your voice is. Certainly, again, having some vocal variation in terms of the volume, having it quieter in parts or louder in parts to emphasize things can be very helpful. And you also want to look at the situation. Like if I'm teaching in the classroom, I usually have to speak louder to make sure people in the back of the classroom can hear me. Whereas if I'm just talking to my computer, I don't have to talk as loudly, right? I'm just recording myself here. So I can have more of a conversational tone. So you may want to make sure you're projecting well enough so people, wherever they are, can hear. If you're giving a speech where there's microphone or some technology, it's good to practice that beforehand. Some places I've noticed have not the greatest sound systems. So I'm using a microphone, but people can't hear me very well. So I may need to hold the microphone a certain way, depending on the type of microphone too, right? There's different types of microphone that pick up volume differently. May need to hold it closer, further away. I may need to project my voice more, even with the microphone. So you're going to want to practice that technology if you have some sort of aid there. Next is pitch, refers to how high or low a speaker's voice is. There's some natural variation among people's vocal pitch, but we have less control over pitch. So males generally have a lower pitch voice than females, but you have some capacity to fluctuate. Again, having some vocal variation can be helpful. Again, I'm not like forcing myself to have vocal variation right now, but I also can be thoughtful not to speak in a monotone voice because a monotone voice is more difficult to listen to, right? So you want some natural vocal variation, with the pitch as well. So again, this last part, I keep talking about vocal variation has its own part here. So that includes changes in the rate, the volume, and the pitch. It can make you seem more prepared, more credible, and able to engage your audience better. I've noticed when students try to read their speeches, they often have very little vocal variation, unnatural pauses. It's difficult to listen to. So again, just being able to speak extemporaneously, you're going to have some vocal variety within your speech just naturally. Most people do as we're speaking. But if we're sitting here reading, then you may not have that. Now, some people can read and have some vocal variation. I try to do that if I'm reading aloud. But again, you have to be very intentional about that then. Whereas if you're just talking, you're more likely to have some natural vocal variation. This next section is about speaking for clarity. So clarity is broken down into articulation, pronunciation, and fluency. So articulation refers to the clarity of the sounds and words that we produce. If someone is articulate, they speak words clearly, and speakers should strive to speak clearly. So you're not mumbling, you're not slurring your words together. Sometimes people, depending on their accent, can certainly not have the most clear articulation. So it can be very helpful to just be thoughtful, especially when you're giving a speech to an audience, to make sure you're articulating and enunciating everything properly. So articulation focuses on the clarity of words, whereas pronunciation refers to speaking the words correctly. So including the proper sounds, letters, and proper emphasis. So sometimes if you're saying somebody's name or a place or some specific piece of information and you mispronounce it, it can make you look not as credible, like you don't know what you're talking about, especially if the audience knows the correct way of pronouncing it. So sometimes I'll even need to go onto Google and say, hey, can you get a pronouncer? How do I pronounce this word? And it will sound it out for me, right? That's one of the great things about technology. You can look up the pronunciation of pretty much any word, any name. Certainly there may be different types of pronunciation for the same word or the same name, especially there may be regional dialects. It may be depending on where that name comes from and how people say it, or there can be just two different ways of saying the same word. But pronunciation is you're saying things correctly. You're not, saying something just not the way that it should be. So pronunciation, you're speaking the words correctly. Articulation, you're saying them clearly. Pronunciation, you're saying them correctly. Then fluency refers to the flow of your speaking. So to speak fluently means your speech flows well and there are not many interruptions to that flow. So fluency hiccups are unintended pauses in a speech that usually result from forgetting what you're saying, being distracted, losing your space and place in your speaking notes. That's okay. That happens, right? That's not a huge deal. Because sometimes students get in their head and say, oh no, I lost my place. Everyone's looking at me. Everyone's judging me. Just give yourself a little bit of pause to catch up. So it's not a huge deal. Verbal fillers are words that use to fill a gap between what people are saying and what they are saying next. So these are the or like. So just fillers. I use some fillers. You probably heard me use some fillers as I'm giving this presentation. If you're listening for those fillers, you're going to be more noticeable. And some people have more noticeable verbal fillers than others. So I've had some students, especially that right? Well, I want to talk about, how our food gets through the ecosystem, right? That is really annoying, right? So just be careful about the verbal fillers. You're not going to get rid of them all completely. And certainly if you're nervous or overthinking it, you may use even more verbal fillers. I have a verbal filler exercise that we do in class where I have some student speak extemporaneously. You're going to have more verbal fillers when you're speaking extemporaneously. That's why we do it that way. And then we clap whenever we hear someone do right? And so that can be very helpful in helping us notice our own verbal fillers because we don't often notice when we're saying these things, but it can be distracting for an audience. 9.3 is about physical delivery now. So we talked about how to reduce public speaking anxiety. We talked about the vocal delivery. Now we're on to physical delivery. So certainly if you're like a professional, if you're a competitive public speaker or professional public speaker, you may be very thoughtful about how am I going to do, what sort of nonverbal movements am I going to do, what sort of hand gestures, what sort of facial expressions. You can be very thoughtful about this. I often just go with whatever is natural to me. I don't overthink this, but certainly it impacts the speech. It impacts those nonverbal elements that can impact how the listener, how the audience understands your speech. So facial expressions can bring to life a speech when used by a speaker to communicate emotions and demonstrate enthusiasm for a speech topic. So again, if you're more into theater, you may be more able to, work with those facial expressions to be natural. Sometimes people say, oh yeah, you make sure you're smiling, right? It makes you look more friendly and happy. People use smiling more for friendliness than to express happiness as an emotion. We're more trying to be friendly. Those facial expressions can help out instead of just having like a grumpy look on your face the entire speech. That may be a little more off-putting, but certainly we can have a neutral look if we're trying to remain professional. So again, it depends on what the topic is. It also depends on our own emotions. So we may be tired, excited, angry, confused, frustrated, sad, confident, smug, shy, or bored. Many other emotions we may be having, which may or may not relate to the speech, and those can come across in our face and how we express ourselves. So again, just be thoughtful about it. I don't expect students to, again, maybe a theater class would help you go with facial expressions. A communication class, I'm not going to sit here and make you practice different facial expressions, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. Next is eye contact. I do have students work on eye contact. It's an important element in communication settings. Eye contact can be used to establish credibility and hold your audience's attention. So again, eye contact is also very culturally specific. So some cultures like a lot of eye contact, other cultures more common to avoid eye contact. It can vary based on interpersonal communication versus public speaking as well. But it's all, culturally specific. But in the United States, especially in a communication classroom, what we expect is for you to have eye contact with your audience. So my audience is this camera. I'm trying to have eye contact. I'm not just staring, reading the screen the entire time. Although if I'm looking at the words, you may not notice. You may not notice that I'm not looking at the camera. I look over here. This is where my face appears. I look over here as kind of my audience. It's a human face. It's my face, but it's a human face instead of looking at the camera. So again, it's just different when you're using technology to give a speech. It's going to be different of where you're paying attention. But I have noticed some students, especially if they're recording their speech, I can see their eyes going side to side as they're reading through their script. And I also can tell because they have a monotone voice and are pausing unnaturally that it's pretty clear when you're reading, even if I can't see you, even if I can't see the paper or see your screen, it's pretty easy for me to tell if you're reading. So eye contact, again, you're focusing not on your notes, but you're focusing on the audience. It's going to help you just, again, be more natural, even with those vocal elements, being able to look away with not look at your notes. But eye contact, you got to look up from your notes, scan the audience. Don't look at the same person the entire time if you're giving a live speech. Don't just stare daggers at their face, right? Look around, scan your audience, and try and be engaging that way is what we recommend. The physical delivery and the body. So certainly we can use a lot of different things related to the body. First here is posture. So sometimes people say, oh, you have to have a good body posture. I slouch a bit, right? So I can kind of speak up, sit up a little bit more. It may look more professional. I went to a presentation once and there were a panel of speakers. One of the speakers was the chief of police, and she had the most like perfect body posture. She was sitting on her chair and her back wasn't even touching the back of her chair. She was just sitting upright, very still, very like perfect posture. I'm like, how do you do that? Right. I slouch a lot. I, lean back in my chair. I don't have the perfect posture. But if we're standing up or if we're presenting, I like having a podium to have my hands on, or even standing next to a podium. It allows me to work to have a good posture as best as I can. But certainly, the posture is going to communicate something about yourself. If you do have a very formal posture, it communicates that about yourself. If your posture is a bit more informal, you're communicating something about yourself. So just be thoughtful about what you're communicating with those nonverbal elements. I'm not telling you have to do one or the other, but again, be thoughtful about what it may mean. Then gestures is the arm and hand movements. Even though I'm on a video right now, I am using my hands, and we see that even if someone's talking on the phone, they'll use hand gestures even if the other person can't see them. Just part of how we communicate. So the gestures include arm and hand movements. Some people are very thoughtful. If you watch professional like competitive speakers, they're going to be very thoughtful with how they do it. They said Bill Clinton often would have a thumbs up and gives, this would be his nonverbal thing and made to make people subconsciously agree with him. So certainly there's a lot of things that you can do to emphasize it. I'm just doing whatever. I mean, I'm using more hand gestures now that I'm talking about hand gestures, but those arm and hand movements, I just do what's naturally comes to me. But sometimes they can be distracting if you're doing too many hand movements. So you may have to kind of like calm yourself down. Again, that's part of the recording yourself, practicing beforehand, getting some feedback. You may not even notice what you're doing with your hands and how that impacts your presentation. But you can be very thoughtful about it as well. And then movement. So often people stand at one spot and give a speech. They'll stand behind their podium, give their presentation. I have seen people, again, stand back and forth, kind of waver a bit, use some movement. That can be distracting, shifting your weight from one foot to another. Certainly, there's people who stand at different parts of the stage for different parts of their speech, especially with the longer speech. I know in terms of like classroom teaching, I've been taught to kind of move around the classroom a bit, to use that proximity to the students to help create those relationships, and also, I don't know if it's half command of the classroom or whatever else, instead of just standing at the front. But again, kind of being in community as well. It talks here about a method that's used a lot, especially in like competitive speech and debate, forensics. They use a triangle of body movement. So they start in the middle, take a couple steps forward, then to the right, then to the left, and return to the center. Again, and that's each different part of the speech. So point A, I'm going to go to the right. Point B, I'm going to go to the left. I'm going to return to the center to end my speech. So again, it's very formal movement. So again, you can think about your movement. Most people are just going to stay in one spot when they're giving their speech, especially in a communication classroom. Then there's credibility and physical delivery. So professional dress and appearance. I try and wear collared shirts when I'm making these videos. Again, part of, even though myself is very small in there, it makes me look a little bit more professional than I'm just wearing a t-shirt. So if I'm teaching in person in a classroom or going to a meeting, I may wear more of a collared shirt. But some meetings, I don't care as much, and I may just be wearing a t-shirt. So again, it depends on, what's appropriate. I don't tell students they have to like dress up in a suit. For my wedding, I didn't even wear a suit, right? I'm not a super formal person. But some people, they say, hey, I'm going to wear a suit because that's going to make me look most credible and professional. But more recently, it's been more business casual has been more appropriate. It depends on the workplace. It depends on where you're giving the speech in terms of what the norms are for professional dress and appearance. So you may want to ask somebody beforehand, hey, what kind of clothing should I wear for this occasion? It can help you just get some insight into it and make sure you're dressed appropriately. Then there's also visual aids. So visual aids play an important role in conveying material to your audience. If you're using technology, practice that technology beforehand to make sure it works. I always recommend having a plan B as well in case it doesn't work. Right? I gave a speech once. I had a presentation and I had a lot of sound in the presentation, and the sound wasn't working. It took forever to get the presentation up. I was giving a speech on technology and like in the nonprofit sector, how to use technology and social media well, and I just felt so incompetent after that. I don't think it went well at all. It was like an hour-long presentation, technology issue after technology issue. I got there 15 minutes early to make sure technology would connect, and it was just a mess. So practice your stuff beforehand, right? If you're using technology, practice it, and if you can practice it in that location, it would be best. So so if it's being uncooperative, you can let it go. And on Zoom too, I've had sometimes speakers will have trouble sharing their screen while also showing their video, and then it keeps crashing and having issues. And again, I understand technology happens. I don't get too judgmental about any of that, but I know from the speakers they share about how like embarrassed they are that this isn't working, that their plan wasn't working. So sometimes it's good to have a plan B or have someone else share your screen even if you're giving a presentation over Zoom. So that is a little bit about delivering a speech, right? We talked about different types of speaking anxiety. We've talked about different types of speeches, the verbal elements, the nonverbal elements. There's a lot to go on with delivering a speech. But the biggest tip is to practice beforehand. Chapter 8 talks about how to prepare the speech. Make sure to take your time to do your research, to outline. Practice it while you're outlining it to make sure everything sounds well. Make sure you're going to deliver in a natural tone of voice. And if you know your stuff well, you can speak in a conversational tone. Just like talking to someone else. You don't have to think of it as a whole big public speaking performance. You're just sharing with someone about what you've learned, on the topic. You may be informing them, you may be persuading them, you may be entertaining them, whatever it may be. Just, again, take the time to practice, and that's going to help you feel more successful. Even mentally practicing, envisioning yourself doing well can be helpful in building your confidence and helping you feel more comfortable with public speaking. When I first started doing public speaking, I hated it. Super nervous, lots of anxiety. I didn't like the audience looking at me. I skipped, speech in high school just because I was too nervous to do it. But I've grown. With practice, I feel a lot more confident speaking in front of groups. I still get nervous sometimes, right? But once I get into it, it's like, okay, this is going to go however it's going to go. And I feel practice. I know what I'm going to say. I prepared for this. So we're just going to go on. Once you get started, you kind of get into it. And if you can feel more comfortable. So again, practice, have more experience with public speaking, and you'll feel more confident over time. So thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. Hopefully you found these tips useful. Always feel free to reach out if you have any questions. But that is the end of chapter 9.